Hello and welcome to this Total Education Media lecture. This is a lecture on Kenneth Slessor and Kenneth Slessor's context and pretext for our studies of his poetry. We're going to do a critical analysis of Slessor's poetry, and in this lecture we're going to give the bare bones of what it is, what Slessor's ideas were, where Slessor's coming from, and where Slessor developed his main thematic concerns. For the full and detailed information that you'll require for any detailed study, go to the website totaleducation.com.au, where the full hour-long lectures there, which will give you very, very detailed information. I'd like to begin by talking about where Slessor comes from in reality, and really Sydney is the basis for Kenneth Slessor. What we're seeing here is that Slessor's work is based around the harbour, and his house was on Elizabeth Bay, and every day he looked out and saw that harbour. It's important to, if you're not living near Sydney or a person near Sydney, that you get an idea of what the harbour is. So now we're just going to cut and have a look at some scenes of the harbour, just to fill you in before we go into a more detailed analysis. Well, so now that we've seen a little bit of the harbour, we can look at what Slessor does and what Slessor saw in that. I'd like to begin to giving a little bit of autobiographical information. And Kenneth Slessor was born in Orange, New South Wales in 1901. So in reality, as he died in 1971, his life covered a fair portion of the 1900s, and this was the period of time when Australia became more urban and sophisticated. And Slessor was a reflection of that in many ways. He was of Germanic origins, and his father brought them up with a little bit of that European sophistication. The dead giveaway is Slessor's middle name, which is Adolf, and that's certainly a very German name, as we all know. And Slessor's background gave him that little bit of sophistication, and he didn't really like the country very much at all. And they moved to the city when he was a young boy, and he really enjoyed it here. And as he grew up in life, he spent most of his life in Sydney and on the harbour. And this was what he wrote about, and this was what he knew. And this really is not to say that Slessor's not worldly or wise. I mean, he travelled as a war correspondent, he went to the war, he was a journalist for the Daily Telegraph, the Bulletin, and a few other, Smith's Weekly, and a few other magazines all his life. And first and foremost, he was a journalist, so he certainly knew the seedy side of life, and he certainly knew about things that weren't poetic, I suppose, in certain terms. But he spent a lot of his time living in Elizabeth Bay with a great view of the harbour. He spent much of his social time in King's Cross, an area we all know is reasonably what we'd term seedy, I suppose, in modern parlance. But in those days, it represented a lot of the bohemian lifestyle, and he had lots of friends there that he hung out with, and they drank lots and they talked, and they were very innovative and forward-looking. And Slessor's poetry reflects this in many ways. When we think about Slessor's poetry and its development, it sort of goes in three great waves. And the first wave is more romantic period, where he's looking at historical things and fantasy elements and things like that, and that's not really our concern. His second period, he becomes a little bit more sophisticated, and he begins to think about and talk about the relevant ideas that do concern us. And it's the third period where the poems we study comes from, and he published these in his 100 poems, and they were all the poems that he thought were worthwhile. And that third period represents a very different movement for Australian poetry, and this is why Slessor is considered one of the greats in Australian poetry, and indeed in many ways in world terms. What Slessor does is he draws away from the idea of the Lawson bush ballad type poetry, and Banjo Patterson, the Man from Snowy River, and all that sort of eccentric bush lifestyle, and that folk myth that had developed around Australia at that particular moment in time. And it moves the poetry to a more sophisticated, urbane, and I suppose what you consider more worldly view, as we think about Australia at that period of time, certainly in the 1900s and before, a lot of the people that were coming back to Australia had been through those two world wars, and they had suffered through the Depression, and most people lived in the city near the coast rather than in the bush and lived that bush lifestyle that was so mythical in Australian lore, I suppose. What's important also in Slessor's poetry is that he draws on Sydney as his inspiration, and he draws especially on the harbour, and that's why we looked at those scenes of the harbour. I mean, we focus on that, and he saw the beauty in that, and he saw the beauty in life. And I suppose when we think about the beauty of life and the beauty in the things he saw, we need to comment very quickly on how his poetry is conveyed to us, and a lot of it's through the senses and the sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, and that's very, very important. And when you read the poems, you should look for those things and make a note of those things. And Slessor's imagery is very complex and important in when it deals with those things, and that's one of the highlights of his poetry. When we think about Slessor, the main idea, I suppose, that we want to consider when we look at a critical study of his poetry, and that's what we're doing, is time. And we need to focus very much our thoughts on how time is conveyed in the poetry. And I think that you'll find in most of these poems it focuses on not just talking about time itself, but dealing with life and death and change and the ever moving progression of time, rather than time as in a watch, or the time that we watch. And the very focus is on that movement, that slow grinding that time does to the world and to people, and how it wears us down. And his focus is on those paradoxes of life and death, and how time passes. And I think you'll find in one of the poems, especially like poems like Five Bells, where he deals with the death of a friend, and that's probably considered Slessor's greatest poem. It's highly evocative, and I think that's the one that most critics draw upon to place Slessor in the upper echelons of poetry, not only in Australia but in the world. And we'll have a look at that poem in great detail in another lecture. We need to think about Slessor's use of time and change, and how he conveys those images in his poetry. And as you read through the poems for the first time, you probably should think about that very carefully and look at how and why he does that, and in what ways he does that. And we have a reasonable range of poems to examine in that respect. When we talk about time and the passing of time and change, we need to think about what Slessor lived through as well, and that's that contextual material I talked about at the start, the different developments in the 1900s that Slessor would have lived through and passed through. And he was trying to integrate those in a very Australian way, and that's what makes certainly Slessor worth studying, and a poet of some merit according to most of the critics. So that's basically where we begin our studies of Slessor, and where we look at Slessor as a critical study and analysis of where the poetry is and what it's doing. And those few little ideas that I've just given you will certainly help you in your study, and certainly allow you to have something to go into the poems with and look at. But remember, in this critical study, it's very important that you bring something of yourself to the poems. So when you read them, jot down and think about what you think the poem means, what the poem means to you, what you think those ideas are, and how Slessor's conveyed those ideas. And I think that's very important in this study, especially, that we can look at what different people think about the poems, and we can analyse the poems very deeply, but it's important that you formalise your own opinion and come up with some sort of theory about Slessor's poetry and what it says about different things, about Australia, about poetry itself, about the way we are, and about what it says to you in particular, and come up with some sort of thesis that you can hold together when we examine these poems in great detail. Don't forget, this small overview is given as a little guide to you, a help for you, but you can go to the lecture at the Total Education website, download that lecture. We have a special offer on Facebook now. If you go to our Facebook site, click like, you'll get certainly a super 50% discount on any products on our range. So you can go to the website, have a look. Don't forget, click the like button down below on this video, pass it on to other people who are studying Slessor, let them have a look at it. There'll be more highlights both on this YouTube channel and on our website for specific lesson poems that you'll be able to take home with you and look at, and we certainly want to help you with your studies and in a study of this critical analysis. Thank you for your time. That's all we're going to talk about today. Goodbye. Best of luck with your studies.